As I've been raving about this book on Twitter and Instagram, you should know that I am obsessed with The Untold Story of Smoketown, the other great Black Renaissance by Mark Whitaker. It's an incredible journey through history that not only offers fascinating 6 degrees of separations, like connecting Andrew Carnegie to August Wilson, but offers readers an endearing experience that I hope we can all reflect on as an ode to what makes America great. When we think about the Great Migration, we tend to think of the plight of Black Americans from the South into the Northeast and Midwest, namely New York and Chicago. But in the early days, many migrants settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a vibrant community would flourish on the foundations of education and enterprise. Smoketown is the story of the Black Renaissance that took place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania during the first half of the 20th century. Immediately after reading this book, I reached out to the author, Mark Whitaker, who so graciously sat down with me and shared more about Pittsburgh's rich history and what drew him to tell this dynamic story.
My first book, I wrote a book, came out I guess about 7 years ago, about it was sort of a family memoir. And I was doing research on my dad's upbringing in Pittsburgh. And I came across a couple of photographs of my grandparents in the archives, digital archives of Teenie Harris, who was this, sort of legendary photographer for the Pittsburgh Courier. But I found these pictures of my grandparents, and when they were sort of at the height of their success, in business and kind of being part of the kind of social world of Black Pittsburgh. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. And then I started looking at all the other photographs in the archives, and there were all of these famous athletes and jazz musicians, and I said, wow, Pittsburgh was really the place, in the day. I got to find out more about that.
Yeah. What would you say made Pittsburgh's Renaissance different from that of like Harlem or Chicago's?
First of all, the Black community in Pittsburgh was much smaller. So one of the things that's amazing about just the sheer amount of talent and accomplishment that came out of there in the period I write about was that it was a fraction of the size of Harlem or Chicago. Harlem, there was a self-consciousness about the Harlem Renaissance. There was a sense as it was happening, we are part of this Renaissance. Sure. There's less of that, I think, in the Pittsburgh story. What was interesting about Pittsburgh is that a lot of the migrants came, particularly in the first couple of waves, from the northern and eastern parts of the Old South. So from the Shenandoah Valley, from Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina. If their parents or their grandparents had been slaves, it's just as likely that they were house slaves, domestic slaves, as opposed to field hands, right? Sure. So they arrived with a high degree of literacy, musical literacy. They played instruments, they could read music. So they sort of arrived with, a lot of cultural sophistication. Then there were educational opportunities that were available in Pittsburgh that were quite rare. Because of all of this Gilded Age, these Gilded Age fortunes, Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, and so forth, Pittsburgh in the beginning of the 20th century had among the best funded public high schools in the country. And those schools were admitting Black students. And the third was this sort of spirit of business and entrepreneurship. It was a city that had been built around industry. It attracted Black folks who were interested in business, who were looking for jobs in the steel plants. Often they couldn't get those jobs in the steel plants, but they started their own businesses.
Yeah. It features the journalists, entrepreneurs, artists, and athletes who would connect Pittsburgh to the greater American cultural narrative. Exports like sports writer Wendell Smith, who was pivotal to the rise of Jackie Robinson, reporter Evelyn Cunningham, who became known as the lynching editor and was vital to the chronicling of the civil rights movement, to artists like Billy Strayhorn and Lena Horne, who nurtured their talents in Pittsburgh. But for me, the most impressive Pittsburgh player was Robert L. Vann. The attorney turned publisher turned editor for the Pittsburgh Courier is one of those people in American history where even if you don't know his name, you know his influence.
He was, I think, one of the most significant Black leaders and interesting Black leaders of his era. Robert L. Vann played a pivotal role in two developments which changed American history, not just black history. So one was that until the 30s, blacks voted overwhelmingly Republican. Yeah. Now, if you don't really know that history, it's kind of mind-blowing, but it kind of makes sense because they were loyal to Abraham Lincoln. But by the early 30s, he had decided that the Republican Party was taking black folks for granted. He gave a speech in which he said it was time for black voters to turn the picture of Abraham Lincoln to the wall. And essentially, he was saying, whatever your emotion tells you, your head should tell you that the current Republican Party is not doing enough for us. And so let's just see what the Democrats will do. So in 1932, the result was that blacks still voted nationally overwhelmingly, it's hard to believe, for Herbert Hoover over FDR. But Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and the surrounding area, the black vote shifts dramatically from Republican to Democratic. And FDR's advisors, political advisors, see this. And they say, well, maybe we actually can get the black vote. And so once he's in office, he puts all of this effort, partly through the Works Progress Administration and other New Deal programs and so forth, in courting the black vote. And so by 1936, you see a dramatic shift. And then the other thing that Van, was front and center for, sadly he died, he was only 61 years old in 1940, before the outbreak of World War II. But throughout the 30s, he was campaigning for greater opportunities for black soldiers. After Pearl Harbor and after America entered the war, Van had died, but his successors launched this campaign in the newspaper that they called the Double V, or Double Victory Campaign. It was basically to say to black America, we should rally around the flag, support the war effort, support the aim of victory abroad, but with the understanding that once that's achieved, we want victory at home. And what victory at home will entail is an end to, discrimination, inequality, and so forth. And that was really, that hope was what really sort of, got black folks to enthusiastically support the war effort and to enlist and so forth and so on. And one of the things that really hit home to me in researching and writing this book was that never happened, right? So the hopes in black America had been so high during the war in terms of how World War II would change things for black folks. We supported the war. We went and fought alongside, white soldiers. We went and worked in the factories, to support the war effort. And afterwards, there was really a belief that that was going to change. It was going to change things, and it didn't. After the war, black workers in the factories were the first to be laid off. Veterans who came home were not able to get the same benefits from the GI Bill that white soldiers did. They looked around and they saw in a lot of these poor urban neighborhoods where they had lived side by side with poor, Italian Americans and Polish Americans and Jewish Americans, those young men and some women, mostly men, had gone off to fight, and they had come back as Americans. It was transformative for poor white ethnic Americans, but it wasn't for black Americans. And what you see is it broke the heart of black America. And I think that in order to understand what happened during the Civil Rights era, and what then happened in the 60s with the urban riots in the North, you have to understand how devastating that heartbreak was. It wasn't coming out of nowhere.
The two dominating themes of what made the Black Renaissance in Pittsburgh so exceptional would have to be the role of enterprise and journalism, specifically the role that the Pittsburgh Courier played in transforming the black community. So this also reads as a love letter to the Pittsburgh Courier in a lot of ways, and the reporters, specifically the women, that chapter on the women saying, we can't cover tea anymore. And even from like the Aurora Reading Club to Edna Chappell and Evelyn, and what sort of role did they play in setting the tone for this Renaissance?
So these powerful women played a big role in the story of Black Pittsburgh, apart from the Courier.
Sure.
But the Courier became a sort of a magnet for women who were interested in being reporters. Initially because one of the ways editorially that the Courier developed this national readership. So I've talked about some of the business strategy. There were a couple of key editorial moves they made. One was the amount of space that they devoted to sports. There was a 20-page paper, 4 pages every week on sports, and often sports on the front page. But the other shrewd thing is they devoted just as much space to what they called women's issues, and as to sports. There was another 4-page section that was all about kind of stories that were of interest to women. Yeah. So if you were interested in reporting, at least there was a place you could go, and they were hiring. So this whole generation in the 40s of ambitious young Black reporters went to the Courier, to jobs at the Courier, to work on the women's desk. Edna Chappelle, Evelyn Cunningham, Hazel Garland, and so forth. By that time, when Robert L. Venn died, his wife, Jessie, took over the paper. So at this point, the Courier also had a female owner and publisher as well. And she was very supportive of giving opportunities to these female reporters.
The portrayal of journalistic ambition and the investment in that ambition is probably one of the most inspirational aspects of this read.
Well, they were crusaders, but the common denominator in all of them was ambition. And this was the thing that I thought was so cool to write about, because so much of Black history, frankly, is really about what Blacks have suffered. But what I found so inspiring about all of these characters was just their level of ambition for themselves and for their communities, despite all the obstacles.
What is your hope that when people read this book that they leave feeling with or knowing?
Well, first of all, honestly, I want them to feel that it was a rich, rewarding read. I mean, honestly.
Check.
2, you know the line from Hamilton?
Is it tomorrow there will be more of us?
No. It's who's going to live, who's going to die, and who's going to tell your story. I hope that I have told the story of some people who otherwise hadn't had their story told in a way that it deserved to be told. Even though it is a story about individuals, and that's very deliberate, I wanted it to add up to a portrait of a community. I wanted people to come away feeling, okay, I've read about a lot of individuals, but I get the community too. And it's interesting, I read about August Wilson at the end, and one of the things that August Wilson said about his plays was that what he wanted to convey was the feeling of Black community.
Smoketown is a story of Black excellence. Smoketown is a story of American ingenuity. And most of all, Smoketown is a story that reminds us that it's our everyday citizens doing the work who make America great. Have you read Smoketown? Leave comments down below because I would love to keep talking about this story. Here are a few complimentary reads. Links to any of the reviews I've done will be down below. And please do come back when you do read it, and I'll be more than happy to keep this conversation going. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, remember to read or be read. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.